All right. Here's another example that I think illustrates the distinction. I read somewhere, and every time I have a student who's also working as a server at a restaurant, usually they disagree with this statement. But I read somewhere that single guys, bachelors, are better tippers than married men. Okay? Now suppose we took that to an even stronger statement. Suppose we said all bachelors are good tippers. Now, how would you determine whether or not that was true or false? I mean, you'd actually go out, right, and do some research. You know, find, you know, some research on the habits of bachelors and how much did you tip, and are you single or married? In other words, this is a synthetic statement. Now consider this statement. Now, the synthetic statement has to do with something about the world. But consider this statement. All bachelors are unmarried. We could say males or men. Would you have to go out into the world structuring a study or interviewing bachelors to find out if they're really unmarried men?
What's the definition of bachelor?
Very, very well done, yes. In other words, what we mean by a bachelor is that a bachelor is basically an unmarried man or an unmarried male. You're right. In other words, an analytic statement is true just by virtue of the words used, just by the definition. So this is Hume's skepticism. He's going to say, I mean, he thinks there's some use to analytic statements, like scientific statements, but they don't tell us anything about the world. Or he says you need to trace things back. And that's where my PowerPoints kind of emphasize the part of Hume's theory where he says, well, test things out. Does that supposed idea that you think has some value and you want to define and defend philosophically, does that idea have any meaning? Can you trace it back to an impression? And with things like material substance as an I don't know what that underlies perceivable qualities, immaterial substance like the soul or the self, the necessary connection in a cause and effect relationship. All of these, Hume says, we cannot defend rationally. Oh yeah, we have to believe that causes and effects work, right? I mean, Hume is not going to walk out a second floor window just because he thinks that we can't justify the cause and effect relationship. But Hume basically is trying to say our human nature makes us act in certain ways, but there are ways that we can't defend philosophically, unlike what many philosophers before him thought, you know. So that's kind of where Hume is about. I was about to call a roll, wasn't I? So, okay, we looked at Hume. This is the second part of Hume's fork, right? Is an analytic. Well, you know, the proposition that we have a self or a soul is not true just by definition, you know. Now Descartes did think that his notion of God was necessarily true, and we looked at the ontological argument. But again, Hume disagrees with that. Oh, how do you tell that something is an analytic truth? Hume's test is, if we denied it, would we result in a contradiction? In other words, it's raining outside. You all know that, right? But there's no contradiction in my saying it's not raining. I mean, in other words, you can deny the statement it is raining without producing a self-contradiction. But for an analytic statement, if you try to deny it, you result in a contradiction. And the easiest way to show that is with a logical law called the law of non-contradiction. You know, not P and not P. In other words, it is not the case that it is both raining and not raining. Again, in the same place at the same time. This is called the law of non-contradiction. If a double negative like elsewhere equals a positive claim. In other words, if I say it is not the case that it is not raining, and if you look at this, you can tell why your English teacher doesn't want you to use a lot of double negatives, right? It's not the case that we... in other words, the statement, it's not the case that it's not raining, simply means it is raining, right? You want to write better, keep double negatives out. And most of them don't have that problem, you know. But what happens with something like this? This is necessarily true. This is called the law of non-contradiction. And it's an analytic truth. Okay? Well, suppose we denied it. It's not the case that not P and not P. Well, the two knots would cancel out and would be simply left with P and not P, which is the most straightforward example of a self-contradiction. it's raining and it's not raining. But you can show, and if you ever take a logic course, you know, this will become clear. You can show that this is the case for every analytically true statement. Its denial results in a self-contradiction, right? But Hume says we can deny the existence of the self without ending in a self-contradiction. So the proposition is not analytically true, if it's true. So is the proposition synthetic? Well, here, to test whether a proposition is synthetic, that's where we go to the test that I showed you, that you say, well, okay, if it's synthetically true and we want to be empiricists, I don't know, we ought to be able to trace our idea, like the idea of a self or soul, back to an impression, back to an experience. And Hume says, well, how would we get an impression of a continuously existing soul or self that continues the same throughout my whole life or your whole life? Well, Hume says the way we would get it is through introspection, through looking into our own minds. But then, what does Hume find when he does this? He says, I don't find an impression of a continuously existing soul or self when I introspect. And so the idea that's based on that has no foundation, and we may not even know what we mean by soul or self or immaterial substance. You know, that's Hume's conclusion. So he has a skeptical view about whether or not we can even defend the claim that we continue as the same person throughout our lives. And he says the only, I mean, I went over this last time, but this is one of the most famous quotes in philosophy. Hume says, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception, a Peter, cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure, but he says I never get an impression of a continuously existing, uninterrupted self. So he says, if that's not an analytic truth, it's not an experience-based synthetic truth either. And so it falls into the category of things that aren't really defensible by reason. He says he can never by introspection catch himself without a perception. That all he, so there's no idea that we can trace back to an impression of a constant and invariable self. So Hume says, I would be skeptical about it. Now see, Berkeley was skeptical about the concept of material substance as an I don't know what that underlies perceivable qualities. But Berkeley, as a good Christian, is not going to go where Hume wants to go. Berkeley still wants to defend the existence of an immortal soul. But Hume says, look, where are we going to find evidence of this if not from introspection into our own minds? And he says, I don't find it from introspection. Now, Immanuel Kant and other philosophers have raised the point of, well, is Hume looking in the right place? I remember when I was in grade school, they would herd us into a room in front of an old TV, and we'd watch the space launches. And I remember one time when the Russian cosmonaut went up, and then it was the old Soviet Union where atheism was the byline of the state, right? So these guys are up there and they've got the world, right, to communicate with. So the Russian cosmonaut goes up there and he says, I'm here in the heavens. I'm looking around. I don't see any God. Must not be any God. You know, where else would I find him but outside my space capsule? Well, of course, the question is that how you would confirm or disconfirm the existence of God anyway? And what Immanuel Kant said against Hume is, the self is not something we have an experience of, but it's what all of our experiences relate to. And so, there are ways to answer Hume on the self. But Hume's own view is that all we can defend philosophically is that what we call ourself is just a bunch of experiences that he says are like, now Hume didn't know about the kind of theaters we have, but he says the mind's a theater where all of these experiences just fleetingly come and go incessantly, but there's nothing that continues the same throughout. And so what Hume says is, as human beings, our human nature steps in where reason fails us, and we tend to impose a sameness on our experience that isn't there. Now, Immanuel Kant said, without a continuing self, we wouldn't have any experience at all, because all of our experiences are the experiences of a self, but we don't have a perception of that self, and yet everything relates to that self, But Hume takes the fact that when he looks into his own mind and he doesn't see a self as evidence that we can't rationally support the claim that we continue as the same self or person throughout our lives. Even though in Hume's everyday life, he believed that. Again, Hume says, look, I'm up there in my room and I'm writing all this skeptical stuff, and then I go down and I enjoy dinner with friends and I play a game of backgammon or two, and he says I go back up and all these skeptical writings seem just cold and stark and far removed. But nonetheless, he never abandoned his skepticism, kept it till the end. Well, look, we're going to look a little bit at the problem of induction. I don't know that we're going to get to ethics if we're going to get these talks in, but that's okay. That's okay. I thought people really good start, today. And if you're not quite sure, what to do or how to go about it, I think your classmates did a pretty good job of things today. Again, if you still owe me your paper, get it in. Better late than never. So we'll have folks. We'll start off with the talks, because and then I'll try to squeeze in some of the problem of induction is at the end of the British empiricism PowerPoint. So anyway, look, take care. Thanks for coming out on such a nasty day. And if anyone came in after I called the roll, let me know you're here. Otherwise, take care, and we'll see you.